Hello everybody, welcome back to Hunt Creative and Woodworking. Today we're going to be building some giant tree scatter terrain out of food containers, household foil, and some trash. Here I've got a paper towel kitchen paper roller, some leftover XPS foam, and some Pringles and drink mix containers. Here I am cutting up the XPS foam into chunks that I can use for this scatter terrain. There's going to be some root knuckles sticking out of the sides of the tree stumps I'm making, and some stone obelisks that'll be scattered throughout the forest that I'm making. And I'm just trimming them to rough size and rounding some of the corners off a little bit, being really careful with my sharp knife. Adjusting the angle at which they sit if I need to. Very organic. I'm not really taking any measurements. I'm just eyeballing much of this stuff. Gather the scraps up, and some of the offcuts are going to turn into root knuckles sticking out of the sides of the trees. Try and use as much of this scrap up as I can so I'm not chucking it into the landfill. And then I'm just going to chop down my cardboard cylinders into rough tree stump shapes. And I'm going with a tree stump look because I can use it both as an actual tree stump, or I can engage a little theater of the mind and suggest that there are tall trees with canopies above these stumps, but that don't obscure the tabletop for my players. How many of us have made scatter terrain or towers or structures out of Pringles cans in our D&D lives or our gaming lives? I'm being very careful with my knife here to make sure that I'm cutting away from my fingers or that I'm jabbing inwards rather than slicing towards my thumb. In some pictures it looks like I might be in danger of losing that thumb, but really I'm jabbing inwards more than slicing towards my fingers. If you're a child or a teenager and you want to try this, maybe ask a grown-up for some help or just be extremely careful. And a container of lemonade drink mix makes for a really huge stump. This is a really good piece because it's big inside, so you can move models inside, you can hide figurines inside, and in fact you could create an entire indoor encounter inside this tree stump if you wished, with passageways leading downwards or upwards from this stump piece that we're about to create. I've got them all cut, nice jagged edges. No measurements, just kind of eyeballing it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap the outside of these containers in crinkled up aluminum foil, shiny side in, flat side out. And this is going to help me create a bark-like texture for the outside of these structures. I'm just using my fingers to sculpt it into place around the smooth bottom and the jaggedy upper edge of this container. And I'm just using my fingers to kind of form the foil to the outside of the piece and make sure the inside doesn't have any weird bits sticking out. And I'm going to use the hot glue on the inside and the outside just to make sure that none of that foil lifts up out of place during the painting process, and that it forms a nice stable foundation for my Mod Podge Paint. If you like these videos and derive value from them, please feel free to subscribe, like, and share. I also have a Patreon page that I'm working on setting up. I don't have any huge rewards as yet, but any donations will go to keeping me flush with materials so that I can continue to make videos like this in the future. Link in my YouTube description. And I'm just trying to be really thorough with the hot glue on the inside to make sure all the foam was held firmly in place, creating a little rough bark-like texture at the same time, using the old DM Scotty Y-lock techniques of sculpting hot glue to my needs. And then here I'm going to add a chunk of that XPS foam as a big old root knuckle sticking out the side of this tree. So I'll hot glue that in place. And I'll do a couple just at random, just eyeballing to make sure it looks the way I want it to. Sitting nice and flat on my cutting mat there so that I know that when it's on the table it'll actually sit reasonably flat on the play surface as well. And now I'm going to wrap the XPS in aluminum foil crumpled up, just the way I did the actual cylinder of the tree stump, just so that it all blends in together. Just kind of sculpting it around that piece of XPS foam with enough overlap on the trunk so that I can glue it into place. Chop off the extra with some kitchen shears, and I'm just working that foil into place the way I want it to. Sorry for the off-camera work here. Just gluing down the flaps of foil to the outside of the tree stump, as you can see here. It's a little bit warm, so be careful. This is a good place for a dual temperature hot glue gun so that you can get the cooler temperature working for you. Foil tends to hold the heat a little bit. And I'm just going to take the time to wrap all three of these root knuckles with some crumpled up foil. Once it's painted up, it'll look really nice and it'll all blend in together. Sculpt it with my fingers off camera because that's the best way when you're filming. And just glue down those extra flaps to make sure that the foil sits firmly against the trunk of the tree. And one more to go, just a little one. Chop off the excess and then just sculpt it into place nice and flat against my cutting mat so that I know it's going to sit nicely on the table. And I'll add a bead to hot glue on those flaps of foil and push them back into the trunk so they're smoothish, as smooth as crinkled aluminum gets. And then I'm just going to use some hot glue trails to sculpt in some root texture, or some bark texturing on the outside of the stump, as well as I had done on the inside of the stump. And when this gets painted up and washed, it's going to look really, really nice. Just random eyeballing it. Nothing's too straight, crooked and wiggly. Just like nature, nothing straight line in nature. I could do the entire surface of the exterior, but then it would be, or would have been, pointless to have wrapped it in foil, and I want the foil to do some of the work for me. So I'm really just doing these trails where I feel it'll add a little extra interest on the table. Some little touches to make sure it's doing what I want it to do. Not too regular. Then off camera I did a bunch more on the others. And here you can see the dried hot glue against the foil. Very organic looking textures and shapes. And there's part of the Pringles can, and I capped off the top with a spare piece of foam core that I had lying around, just so that I could get some models up there, or I could build a structure or a building to sit on top of the stump later. This one needs the hot glue texturing, so I'm going to set it aside. There's the kitchen paper roller, the paper towel roller, and the other half. And these are just stone obelisks that I'm going to scatter throughout the forest as well. Also made of XPS foam wrapped in tinfoil. I just glued them to some chipboard bases. I'm going to use the hot glue to hold down that flap of foil that was sticking out. And I'm just going to add that same wriggly bark texturing on the outside of this piece. Pardon my camera's focus, it's having a hard time deciding what I want it to focus on, and it's automatically changing, and that's annoying. Just nice organic strings to represent more bark texture on the outside of this stump. Irregular lines, irregular spacing. Very organic, just kind of eyeballing it. And just a little touch up on that flap of foil that wants to stick out a little bit. And I've sculpted the top to look a little bit like tree rings. Now I'm just going to mix some of my coffee colored brown paint with some Mod Podge, matte colored Mod Podge, matte finish. I'm going to coat all of the pieces. This is going to add durability to the foil on the outside, and it's going to bond the whole piece into a single unified hunk. I'm just using dollar store craft brushes, slathering it on all over. Looking for about 99% coverage. I'm not too fussy about it, but I do want to make sure all of the foil is protected by the Mod Podge. And I'm not too worried about the color of this Mod Podge either. I added brown paint to it so that if any of my paint job were to miss a spot, it should appear as kind of a medium brown. Help me out a little bit. I'm just going to take a few minutes and coat all of these pieces. In 2 weeks, I'm going to release another video showcasing how I crafted some denizens that live in this sacred grove of enormous tree trunks. And make some high quality table worthy miniatures out of paper clips and dollar store bits. But right now I'm just going to concentrate on getting all surfaces of these pieces coated with my brownish Mod Podge. It's nice to be generous because you don't want any of the foil to show through. And because the foil is nice and crinkly, it's going to handle the generosity of the Mod Podge fairly well, and we're not going to lose too much of the detail that we want. You may have to come back and touch up some spots after you're done, or after it dries. Ideally, we don't want any of the aluminum to be showing through the paint at the end. And you could easily craft additional pieces to go along with these that nest inside the cut off tops, the jagged part at the top, and sit on top of the platform that I've created. So there could be a treehouse or a watchtower fort or more tree trunk, or even a tree canopy that kind of nests in there and gets removed for play if you'd like. I personally don't mind going with a little bit of theater of the mind for that sort of thing. I like to hint at what I'm going for on the table rather than be a perfectionist about every microscopic detail. And that works for me. You, of course, will have to find a method that works for you. And this honkin' big piece, the hollow trunk made from the drink crystal can, is big. And it takes a few minutes to coat with the Mod Podge. And I apologize for doing some of the work off screen. We'll get there. This is a reasonably simple craft. You could probably accomplish this entire crafting setup in a single day. Maybe 2 days if you have to walk away during dry time. Definitely in a weekend if you wanted to. I'm just slathering that Mod Podge all over. And it's true, I will have leftover brown Mod Podge after this, but that's okay. I can use it for other projects. I'm not too married to any specific color of Mod Podge. Black works well for some things, but brown works well for other things. Now I'm going to add some dollar store lichen in patches to the outside of these trees, just to make them come alive, feel like they're a living entity. And I'm going for a very random presentation here. I'm just throwing it on where I think it'll look good. Not too worried about the sizes of the patches, but I am trimming the bottom so it sits flat on the table. And you can see I'm working on an old scrap of plywood that I have cut things on in the past instead of my cutting mat for this, and that's just to make it easy to clean up. I can just brush all the little bits and pieces of moss into a pile and move the entire plywood plank to another spot when I want to store it for later. And I'm going to be using this moss to help construct those dollar store minis that I was talking about previously, the denizens of the Sacred Grove. And I'm just using a craft stick to push the moss into the hot glue. Keeps my fingers from getting too warm. Pardon my glasses. Here's that honkin' big piece made out of the lemonade crystal can. And again, I'm just going to hot glue some moss in wherever I think it'll look good. I'm being pretty generous with this because the pieces are big. Again, I'm using the craft stick to push the moss into the hot glue while it hardens a little bit. Protect my fingers from the heat of the glue. This would also be a good spot to use a low temperature glue gun if you have one, or a dual temperature glue gun. Just going to surround that entire root knuckle in this moss lichen. Touches of glue to the edges just to make sure that there's not something that's going to be easily snagged and pulled off of this piece. Trim the bottom so it sits nice and flat on the table surface. More patches of the lichen in place so it looks nice. Trim the bottom. A couple of more pieces and we'll be ready to go. So now that I've got the lichen on there, I'm going to sponge paint on and dry brush additional brown colors. Straight up brown, kind of a medium brown. I don't want a single uniform color around the entire piece. I want there to be variation between one bit and the next. I don't mind if I get a little bit of the brown paint on the lichen because it'll just help it blend into the piece. And this is the opportunity to make sure that we don't have any silvery bits of foil showing through. I'm still using that piece of plywood because it's handy and the was already in place. I'll go back to my cutting mat for the minis that I create for next video. I'm using a dollar store makeup applicator brush to dry brush across these stumps. These things are great for dry brushing. Being fairly heavy-handed with this dry brush right now. Sure I get good coverage, and I also want to make sure that I bring out the texture of those hot glue streaks that I used to give a bark texture to the tree. And I'm going to dry brush my obelisks with the same brown paint. I'm going to use 3 or 4 different colors of dry brush on these to give them a really nice organic stone consistency. Stone's not just gray, it's got all kinds of different stuff going on, so it's going to make them look really good and blend in with my scatter terrain as well. And of course I'm dry brushing off camera because when you make videos, that's how you make things. One of these days I'm going to learn. There we go. No. I don't know why I want to pull things in close to my chest when I'm doing this. Anyway, I hit all the sides and the bottom edge where I have also textured a bit with some hot glue. And I'm going to use a 60-40 mix of medium green and water as kind of a heavy wash. And I'm just going to run this down my hot glue trails that I use to make the bark texture. And what this is going to do is it's going to make those textures pop just a little bit more. So sitting on the table, they're going to stand out a little bit as not brown. So the tree stumps don't look like giant poops sitting vertically on the table. They're going to have a little more character and a little more feel. And once this is done and dried, off camera, I'm going to coat each of these with matte finish Mod Podge to protect all the work I put into painting and texturing these things. I want them to be durable and last as long as I can make them. And I also am lazy, so when I put them away in a drawer or a box, I want to be able to just chuck them in there without worrying about chipping paint or rubbing off parts of the foil or what have you. That dual layer inside and outside of the Mod Podge are going to make these extremely durable. And it looks quite green here when I'm applying it wet, but it dries quite a bit duller than that when it's done. It still adds visual interest, but it's not quite as stark a contrast between the brown and the green, which is what I'm going for. I don't want it to be hit you in the face goblin lime green on these trees. I just want a hint of green, a hint of life. I'm not washing any of the lichen or the moss that I added because I want the colors that it contains to remain as they are. And if you were concerned about the patches of moss and lichen, you could probably hit them with a spray coat of matte finish Krylon lacquer or matte finish varnish of some kind. I'm not too worried about it. I know it'll shed a little bit, but I can live with that. Nice focus. Come on, camera. There we go. To see if I can make my DSLR Canon do this filming for me instead of my phone, because then I can just set the focus the way I want it and leave it there. A little more wash over the top of that root knuckle. Good focus, camera. You're a superstar. Alright, so I'm just doing a little bit of green wash around the base of these stone monoliths. And that'll give the impression that there's a little bit of mossy growth at the bottom and kind of disguise the joint between the cardstock base and the monolith itself. And here they are on my ultimate dungeon terrain, set up to be dirt or cave. with a few minis to show the scale. Something big and winged is inside that really big stump. We have a large model on top of this stump here. And another model over here. Thanks for joining me at Hunt Creative. Join me in 2 weeks while I'll release another video. Thanks for coming out.